There are moments in life that leave an indelible mark on your soul, experiences so terrifying that no amount of rational thought can explain them. This is one of those stories. What you're about to hear is not a work of fiction, but a real account, told from the perspective of someone who lived through it. It takes place in the dead of night, in the shadows where logic and reason lose their grip, where something far more sinister takes hold. Imagine hearing footsteps outside your window every single night, dragging, slow, deliberate. And no matter how many times you try to catch what's making the noise, you're met with an eerie, oppressive silence. You think you're alone, but the truth is far more terrifying. Before we delve into this unsettling tale, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, Sinister Stories, and share it with your friends who crave real-life horror. This story is about fear in its rawest form, the kind that seeps into your mind, makes your heart race, and keeps you wide awake at night. Now turn down the lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a journey into the unknown. This is a first-hand account of something inexplicable, something that defies the boundaries of our world. And once you hear it, you might find yourself listening for those same footsteps in the darkness of your own home. The house stood on the outskirts of town, a simple, old structure that had seen better days. It was the kind of place where the walls seemed to whisper secrets, where every creak in the floorboards made you feel like you weren't truly alone. I had just moved into this student house, a republic shared with 6 other guys. 4 of them were from the agricultural engineering program, guys from small towns, unshaken by the isolation. But there was something about the house that unnerved me from the start. My room wasn't inside the main building like theirs. No, my room was in a small outhouse in the backyard, away from the warmth and safety of the others. The backyard was a desolate space, surrounded by high, shadowed walls, and the only way to reach my room was through a narrow stone path that cut through the overgrown weeds. Each night, after my roommates had gone to bed, I found myself alone in the darkness, separated from the house by just a few feet, but feeling like I was a world away. My window faced that same cold courtyard, and from the moment I moved in, I could sense it, the strange weight in the air. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, but then the footsteps started. Every night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I'd hear them, slow, dragging footsteps moving across the courtyard. At first, I thought it was one of the guys, but when I looked, there was nothing. No one. The sound was unmistakable, though, like something heavy being pulled across the ground, deliberate and unhurried. It wasn't the sound of someone walking. It was something far more disturbing. Night after night, the footsteps returned, each time drawing closer to my window, each time filling me with a growing sense of dread. There was no explanation, no way to rationalize what I was hearing. Whatever it was out there, watching, waiting, and I had the terrifying sense that it knew I was alone. The first time I heard the footsteps, I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, the house was old, the wind could make strange noises, and maybe it was just the woods settling. But as the nights went on, it became impossible to ignore. The sound wasn't random or fleeting. It was deliberate, steady, like someone, or something, was pacing through the courtyard with a purpose. I tried to rationalize it at first. Maybe it was one of my roommates, restless and unable to sleep. But when I mentioned it casually to them the next morning, they all denied being awake at that hour. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. As the nights passed, the air grew colder around the time the noise started. I could feel the temperature drop suddenly, like a cold breath against my skin. My room, which had always felt isolated, now felt like a trap, a place where I couldn't escape from whatever was lurking just beyond the door. The unsettling feeling of being watched grew stronger, a gnawing sense that something was just outside my window, staring in. One night, determined to prove I wasn't going crazy, I decided to wait by the door. I stood there, holding my breath, ears straining for the familiar dragging sound. It came, just like clockwork. Footsteps, slow and heavy, making their way across the courtyard. My heart pounded in my chest as I flung the door open, hoping to catch whatever, or whoever, was out there. But the moment the door swung wide, the noise stopped. Silence. Nothing. The courtyard was empty, as if no one had ever been there. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, just beyond the reach of the light. That night, I realized this wasn't something I could explain away. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and it was getting closer. As the nights dragged on, I found myself caught between two opposing forces, fear and curiosity. Every fiber of my being told me to ignore the sounds, to pretend that whatever was out there didn't exist. But something deep inside urged me to investigate, to confront the unknown lurking just beyond my door. The footsteps had become more than just a nuisance. They were an intrusion into my mind, haunting my thoughts even during the day. I couldn't focus on anything else. Every creak, every shadow seemed to hint at the presence I felt so strongly at night. I knew the rational thing to do was to ignore it, but the mystery of it gnawed at me, daring me to solve it. One evening, I finally brought up to the guys. We were sitting in the kitchen, casually talking about weird experiences and ghost stories. I mentioned the footsteps, fully expecting them to laugh it off. But to my surprise, the room fell silent. One by one, each of them admitted to hearing the same thing. They had all assumed it was me, wandering the courtyard at night. The realization hit us all at once. None of us had been making those sounds. That's when the fear really set in. If it wasn't any of us, then who or what was walking outside every night? The tension in the house skyrocketed. The tough guys who had brushed it off before now had a glint of fear in their eyes. Some tried to joke about it, masking their unease with bravado. But the truth was undeniable. We were all hearing the same thing, and none of us could explain it. That night, no one slept well. Every small sound made us jump. Even the bravest among us couldn't deny the eerie weight that now hung over the house like a dark cloud. The footsteps, once a solitary torment, had now become a collective fear. And as the hours passed, I found myself asking the same terrifying question. Should I face whatever was out there, or let the fear consume me entirely? That night, the house was gripped by a silence that was far more unsettling than any noise could have been. We all knew the footsteps would return, and this time, the weight of dread was shared by everyone. I lay in bed, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting. Every minute felt like an eternity, the ticking of the clock amplifying the tension in the air. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, it began. The familiar, haunting sound of slow, dragging footsteps moving across the courtyard. But tonight, something was different. The steps were heavier, closer, as if whatever was out there had grown bolder. My heart raced, but this time, fear gave way to determination. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows, no matter the risk. Grabbing my flashlight, I moved toward the door, every step feeling like I was walking into a nightmare. As I opened the door, the cold hit me like a wave. The temperature had dropped drastically, and the air felt thick with something unnatural. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the courtyard, but as always, there was nothing, no movement, no signs of life. And then, just as I began to lower the light, something caught my eye. A flicker of movement near the far wall. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I raised the flashlight again, and this time, I saw it. A shadow, long and distorted, creeping across the ground, but there was no one there to cast it. The shadow moved as if it had a life of its own, shifting and slithering like some dark, malevolent force. My body went cold, paralyzed with fear, as I watched the impossible unfold before my eyes. The footsteps continued, but now they echoed louder, reverberating through the courtyard, as if the shadow itself was making the noise. In that moment, I felt something I had never felt before. Pure, unfiltered terror. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The shadow crept closer, and I could feel its presence, its hatred. It was like the air had turned to ice, suffocating me with its intensity. My mind raced, grasping for any explanation, but there was none. This was no trick of the light, no figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was coming for me. As the shadow crept closer, my breath came in short, ragged bursts. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but my legs felt as though they were rooted to the ground. The temperature around me plummeted, and with each step the shadow took, the air seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on me with an unseen force. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It was impossible. How could a shadow move without a source? How could something so intangible feel so threatening, so malevolent? The dragging footsteps echoed louder now, matching the shadow's pace, as if some unseen force was dragging itself across the courtyard toward me. And then, the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just a ghost. This wasn't some restless spirit or lost soul. It was something much darker, much older. I could feel it in my bones, a deep, primal fear that told me this presence was ancient, something that had existed long before I had ever stepped foot in that house. This thing, this entity, had been watching us, feeding on our fear, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And now, I was standing face to face with it, or as close as one could come to such an unspeakable force. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The shadow, which had been creeping steadily toward me, halted in its tracks. The silence that followed was deafening, more terrifying than any noise could have been. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief second, the courtyard was plunged into complete darkness. When the light returned, the shadow was gone, but the feeling of its presence remained, hanging in the air like a dark cloud. I stood there, trembling, unable to process what had just happened. Was it over? Had I imagined it? But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was only a warning, a reminder that the thing lurking in the shadows wasn't bound by time or space. It could come back anytime, and when it did, it wouldn't be satisfied with just footsteps in the night. The next morning, I woke with a start, still gripped by the memory of the shadow and the cold, oppressive presence from the night before. The sun's rays filtered through the curtains, casting long beams of light across the room, but it did little to comfort me. I felt a heaviness in the air, as if the terror of the previous night still lingered, just beneath the surface. My body was tense, my mind racing, and no matter how hard I tried to shake it, the fear clung to me like a second skin. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong with the house, something that none of us could explain. That day, the house was quiet. My roommates returned from their weekend trips, but no one spoke about the footsteps. It was as if we had made an unspoken pact to ignore the events, to pretend that the terror that stalked us at night wasn't real. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt, and no amount of denial or laughter could erase the truth. Whatever was haunting the courtyard wasn't done with us. It had shown itself to me, revealed just a glimpse of the horror that lurked beneath the surface. That night, I stayed awake, waiting for the footsteps, waiting for the shadow to return. But the house was eerily silent. No dragging, no creaking floorboards, just a suffocating stillness that felt far more ominous. As the hours passed, I began to realize that the entity wasn't gone. It had simply retreated, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even in broad daylight. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows, sent chills down my spine. The house had become a prison, trapping us all in a state of fear and unease. We tried to go about our days as usual, but the sense of dread hung over us like a storm cloud, always present, always watching. The shadow's warning echoed in my mind. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot. Whatever it was still out there, waiting in the darkness, biding its time. And deep down, I knew that when it returned, it wouldn't just be footsteps in the night. It would be something far worse, something that none of us would be prepared to face. The house may have appeared normal to outsiders, but to those of us who lived there, it had become a place of nightmares. And as the days turned into weeks, we all became haunted by the same question. When would the shadow return, and what would it want when it did? None of us were brave enough to find out. Weeks passed, but the unease never left me. Even during the day, when the house was filled with the usual chatter and normalcy of student life, the memory of that shadow clung to my thoughts like a dark stain I couldn't wash away. Nights were the worst. Though the footsteps had stopped, replaced by a deafening, eerie silence, I could feel it. Something lurking just beyond the walls, watching, waiting. It was as if the house itself had become aware of us, aware of our fear, and was feeding on it. The other guys pretended everything was fine, but their eyes betrayed them. None of us had been the same since that night. I tried to move on, tried to shake the lingering dread that had settled into my bones. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was over, that had been my imagination playing tricks on me, I knew deep down that the experience had changed me. The world didn't feel the same anymore. It was as though the thin veil between our reality and something darker, more sinister, had been lifted, and now I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't unfeel the presence that still seemed to watch me from the shadows. One evening, after a long day of classes, I sat in the backyard, staring at the courtyard where the footsteps had once echoed. The place looked so ordinary in the fading daylight, empty, quiet, innocent. But I knew better. I had come to realize that some things aren't meant to be understood, and some terrors don't fade with the sunrise. The shadow wasn't just a ghost or spirit. It was something ancient, something that existed beyond time, beyond reason. And it had chosen our house, our lives, as its playground. Sometimes, I wondered if it would follow me when I eventually moved out, if I'd hear those dragging footsteps again in some other darkened corner of my life. The thought chilled me to the core. No matter how far I ran, how much I tried to bury the memory, I couldn't escape the feeling that it wasn't over. Not for me, not for any of us. The house, the shadow, it had left a mark on us. Something invisible, yet deeply ingrained in our minds. I had survived the encounter, but at what cost? I was no longer the same person who had laughed off ghost stories and dismissed the idea of the supernatural. Now I knew. There are things in this world, and perhaps beyond it, that defy explanation. Things that watch, that wait, that feed on fear. And sometimes, they find a way into our lives, leaving behind a lingering terror that never truly fades. As I got up and walked back into the house, I felt it, a shift in the air, the slightest chill that sent a shiver down my spine. I paused at the door listening. Nothing. But even in that silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow hadn't gone. It was still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. And when it did, I feared it wouldn't just be watching. It would want something more. If you've ever felt the same, like something dark is watching you, leave your story in the comments below. You're not alone in this. And don't forget to subscribe to Sinister Stories, because sometimes the scariest stories are the ones we can't explain.